Secretary Graham, by all accounts, it was the National Security Advisor John Bolton, who we know is very hawkish over Iran, that requested the UK government seize this Grace 1 ship off the coast of Gibraltar. Was that a fairly cynical attempt, knowing what the reaction of the Iranians would be, to get the Europeans to come closer to the American side? I mean, it would be a very clever way to do it, but it seems to have worked out quite well. Hello and welcome. I'm Christian Fraser in London. Laura Trevelyan is in Washington. The UK is in a strategic bind. There are 8 British flagged ships in the Gulf at present, and the depleted Royal Navy doesn't have the means to guarantee their safe passage through the Straits of Hormuz. The British government could call on American strength in the region. President Trump has proposed a US-led military convoy, but what signal would that send when the UK has such big differences with Washington on the future of the Iranian nuclear deal?
Today, the British Prime Minister called a Cobra meeting to discuss how best to respond to the Iranian capture of the British tanker Stena Impero. And out of that meeting, the British Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt announced plans to assemble a European-led maritime protection mission to protect freedom of navigation in the region.
We will now seek to put together a European-led maritime protection mission to support safe passage of both crew and cargo in this vital region. We've had constructive discussions with a number of countries in the last 48 hours, and we will discuss later this week the best way to complement this with recent US proposals in this area.
The Stena Impero is now in the Iranian port of Bandar Abbas and is flying an Iranian flag. UK authorities have told all British flagged ships to avoid the strait until further notice. But as you can see from this live map from the last hour, the strait is still a very busy waterway, transporting around 1/5 of the world's oil. All the red boats are oil tankers and the green ones are cargo vessels. The US has its 5th fleet based in Bahrain to oversee the Navy's presence in the Gulf.
The UK's Royal Navy has the HMS Montrose and has now also deployed the HMS Duncan. We don't yet know what other support other European nations will offer, but the Foreign Secretary did speak to his French and German counterparts this weekend. NATO have told us today that none of their standing maritime groups have any military presence in the region, and they have not received any request for assistance from the UK. Well, let's get the thoughts of the Conservative MP Bob Seely, who sits on the Foreign Affairs Committee. Mr. Seely, thank you very much for joining us. I know you were quite critical of the government over the weekend. You think they dropped the ball here. Are you reassured by the announcement we've had from the Foreign Secretary this afternoon?
Well, in part, I think we have a historic problem that we've underfunded the Royal Navy and our armed forces for about 10, 20 years. We took the peace dividend from the Cold War and we didn't reinvest when times started to get bad again about 15 years ago. So I think we've had a problem there. And I think using hindsight, it was perhaps not difficult to guess that the Iranians would try to seize a UK ship. Let's see what happens. I think the Foreign Secretary did quite well today, but I think there's a limited amount that we can do.
But even if you were to put a fast-moving escort into place, you'd still need to have fairly robust rules of engagement. Are we at that point? Are we ready to engage the Revolutionary Guard?
Well, you don't necessarily have to have that robust rules of engagement. You can have self-defence rules of engagement, and that would cover most things.
And Mr. Seely, it's Laura in Washington. Do you think the UK should ask NATO for backup in the Strait of Hormuz now?
Yes, I do. I think we need to... we shouldn't be uncomfortable working with the Americans because we work so closely with them. But I do think it's worthwhile trying to get as many allies as possible engaged. I wish we had more force there ourselves so we could take more of a leadership role, but we don't. We have 3 or 4 minesweepers attached to the 5th Fleet, which are a very important strategic asset, and we have HMS Montrose, which is going to be joined by another Type 45 destroyer, and there will be a period of overlap for the 2 of them there. If we can work with our European colleagues and effectively escort groups of ships through the Gulf and the Straits of Hormuz, that is going to be the best bet, because we don't want to be in a position where we have to get ships back from the Iranians. It's much better to be in a position where it's very difficult for the Iranians to take our shipping in the first place if they wish to escalate, and it does seem at the moment that they wish to escalate this crisis because the sanctions are really hurting them, and the thinking seems to be in Tehran that if they're going to hurt, then they want other people to hurt as well.
Mr. Sealy, what would you like to see the US do now? They pulled out of the Iranian nuclear deal. They're applying this campaign of maximum pressure. Is there really a chance of renegotiating that deal under these circumstances?
The US pulled out in May last year. Secretary of State Pompeo listed 12 demands. And I think some of those demands are probably a little bit unrealistic and frankly just too broad. What I would like to see very much the Europeans doing, and that includes this instance the British as well, is to work to see what it would take for the Americans to get back into the Iranian deal process, and then talk to Tehran about what it would take them to do, that it would take for them to start talking to the US or go-betweens.
We've just been looking.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was just going to say, we've just been looking at pictures of this ship now in the port of Bandar Abbas, and it's seemingly flying an Iranian flag. The Iranians would seem to be open to a straight swap. So that ship for the Grace 1, which was detained off the coast of Gibraltar, would you be open to that, and how would you facilitate it?
I think you can have a slight complexity in international law, because the Grace 1 was seized because it was involved in illegal operations, selling oil, or being involved in supplying oil illegally to Syria. So I think there is a problem with what the Grace 1 was going to do and what it was engaged in. However, regardless of the short-term fix, there is a longer-term problem. This crisis is only going to get worse as long as there is no resolution in sight to the JCPOA, to the comprehensive agreement, the so-called Iranian nuclear deal. And there is only going to be an easing of relations between not only Iran and the US, but also Iran and its Sunni neighbors, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, UAE, etc., once there is a new fix to the Iranian nuclear deal. And if there isn't, there will be growing crises and there will be a series of escalations, even if at times things quieten down for a period. So things are going to get worse unless there is a fix to the JCPOA.
Bob Sealy, very grateful for your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
When US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo was asked today what role the US is playing in getting back Britain's oil tanker, this is what he had to say.
So the responsibility in the first instance falls to the United Kingdom to take care of their ships.
So does that sound like evidence of the so-called special relationship between the UK and the US? Well, joining us now is former Defence Secretary William Cohen. Secretary Cohen, thanks for being with us. What do you make of Mike Pompeo's tone towards Britain? It's your tanker.
Well, he's right. Correct. He's correct on the issue of is it UK's responsibility initially. But if we are to maintain this special relationship, we have to signal to our British friends that we're all in this together. Yes, we're going to protect American ships flying the American flag going through, but I think that we should work with all of our allies in the region and not say over to you. I think it's really important for global economic security that the United States continue to play a key role.
And now, what do you make of the Iranians saying that they have arrested what they call CIA spies and even threatening to put some of them to death? The US is saying this is all lies, but you have experience of the Iranians. What's your assessment?
I have no way of knowing whether they're telling the truth or lying. I think it's another example of where they're trying to do things to engage the international community in order to persuade us that we should relieve them from some of the sanctions, or else they're going to continue to do more and more things which are going to touch the conscience of many people. So I see this more as an irritant, that they're trying to play their hand to say we can be really bad people. Well, we know that, but that's just their way of trying to cope with these sanctions right now.
Secretary Cohen, by all accounts, it was the National Security Advisor John Bolton, who we know is very hawkish over Iran, that requested the UK government seize this Grace 1 ship off the coast of Gibraltar. Was that a fairly cynical attempt, knowing what the reaction of the Iranians would be, to get the Europeans to come closer to the American side? I mean, it would be a very clever way to do it, but it seems to have worked out quite well.
Well, if we start playing those kinds of chess games in which we're going to try and bring other countries closer to us on the issue, then I think it could be successful, it could backfire. I think we have to be very careful here. I don't think we have a clear strategy. I don't know what the administration wants to achieve. The president has said, and the Iranians have said, we don't want war. Okay. Now, do we want diplomatic dialogue? Well, the Iranians have signaled they do. I think we have signaled that we do. So what is the holdup on this particular point? I think here the British can play a very positive role in trying to negotiate on their bilateral deal with Iran, to do that on a more comprehensive basis in terms of the overall relationship that Iran now has with the U.S. and other countries. So I think the Brits can take the lead on this, and I think, frankly, they can play a broker as far as trying to find out why the U.S. and the Iranians can't sit down and start some sort of negotiation, so we don't have no war, no diplomacy, nothing happens except an increasing in the tensions.
You're a former Defence Secretary. You heard Bob Seeley there talking about the lamentable state of the Royal Navy. It is less than half the size that it was at the end of the Cold War. 13 frigates and 6 destroyers. Is it remiss of successive British governments to get to a state like that when we have such trading, such important strategic assets in the Gulf?
Well, I could point to the British. I could point to many of the NATO members. I think President Clinton has been, sorry for the slip, President Trump has been correct in saying to the NATO allies, you have to do more. The United States cannot carry this kind of a load for any length of time into the future. So it's up to the NATO countries to say, yes, let's meet our 2%, let's do more. Let's not ride on the coattails of the United States as we have been doing in terms of putting more money into soft power as opposed to hard power. So I think there's something there for the Europeans to take to heart.
Secretary Cohen, thank you so much for being with us.
Pleasure.
Laura, I'm sort of confused because it seems to me that Washington blows hot and cold on what it wants to do with Iran. We had the Qataris in town last week, and we were talking on this programme about them being the interlocutors and peace talks maybe starting. And then you listen to Mike Pompeo today and he talks up the rhetoric again. What is going on in Washington?
You might well ask, Christian, and I don't know that I can tell you, but I can tell you that only last week the President and the Secretary of State appeared together in public and they sounded really upbeat about the fact that there could be talks with Iran, that progress was being made. The Iranians immediately fired back and said, absolutely not, we're not talking about our ballistic missiles. Of course, it's a cliche, a trope almost, but you do have the hawks in the administration. You were talking about John Bolton, the National Security Advisor, and yet the President himself is super flexible. He's open to talks. He loves to have that photo op with the bad guy. So, frankly, who knows what's happening, but everybody is watching it and trying to figure it out, Christian.
Is it the art of the deal? We shall see.
We shall indeed. Well,